Welcome to Attainable Green. I'm Jess, and today we're going to be talking about seedlings. This is a care collab with several other YouTubers to share how we take care of seedlings in our respective environments and setups. So the channels that are going to be talking about this topic today are Fernanda Nascimento, Orchids and Succulents, Tropical Plants Finland, Justin's Orchids and More, What's Up Orchids, Matt by Nature, Danny's Orchid Journey, Toki World, Stephen Van Campen Lewis, Orchids and Finbos, Plants and Other Things, and Ninja Orchids. So we're going to share our experiences with seedlings, and I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I know, and hopefully this will be helpful for you. So first off, what are seedlings? The term orchid seedlings can be used quite generally in the orchid industry, and for me it kind of refers to two different sets of plants. In the first set, orchid seedlings kind of refer to plants that were recently deflasked. Now, when it comes to orchid seeds, they are microscopic, and in most cases, it takes laboratory conditions to grow them and germinate them. And after they are grown in the lab environment, they are deflasked and then adjusted to the natural environment. Usually, these ones have multiple terms like flask babies or orchid seedlings. So these ones are very, very young orchid plants that are not blooming size. The second definition of orchid seedlings is primarily used in the nursery industry. When you buy a plant from an orchid grower, they usually mention that it might be blooming size, near blooming size, or seedling size. And those terms generally describe the size or maturity of the plant that you will get. Blooming size means that the plant will bloom within 1 year. Near blooming size is within 2 years, and seedling size may take 2 to 3 years or more, depending on the size of the plant that is described. Generally, different orchids from different genus have different times of maturity. For example, Phalaenopsis, Tolumnias, and Sarcochilis are known to be able to be blooming size within 2 years or 3 years out of flask, which is considered quite fast. On the opposite side of the spectrum, certain Vandas, Cattleyas, or Paphiapetalums can take 5 to 10 years to go from deflasking to blooming size. So the blooming aspect of the plant will depend highly on which specific species or hybrid that you have. So to start off, I have a Phalaenopsis bastanii that I got from Flask last year. I deflasked them, I put them in moss, and I put them under grow lights. This year, there are several plants that look quite large and had great growth, and some are also still quite small. So looking at the larger plant, I think that this will probably take another year or two before it reaches blooming size. When you compare it with a more mature plant like this Dorytis pulcherrima, you can see there is a huge difference in size and scale. This Dorytis pulcherrima is considered a first bloom seedling. So this plant has not bloomed yet, and if you look very closely, there is a spike just emerging. So this plant is on its way to its first spike. So comparing the Phalaenopsis bastanii that came from Flask as a baby plant to the Dorytis pulcherrima, there is quite a difference. So I would guess that the Dorytis pulcherrima is at least 3 years old from Flask, and it's finally large enough to create a spike. As for the bastanii, I'm trying to use it as a similar comparison. It still has a ways to go before it can be big enough to bloom. So having a seedling size Phalaenopsis is usually not too bad. If you get one that's this kind of larger 3-year-old size, then maybe waiting a year or two for it to bloom is not such a bad thing. If you get it from Flask, it may take also 2 to 3 years as well. So the difference between cost and maturity of the plant is not a huge gap, so I think it's worthwhile to try to get a blooming size plant if possible. But if you are only able to find a seedling size or even flasks, I think that the wait is not as lengthy as other plants. So I think that phals have an easier entry point for growing seedlings to blooming size versus other plants from another genus. For comparison to the pretty fast growing Phalaenopsis, I have Cattleyas. So here I have Cattleya Seedlings. I got this last year from Flask, and this is what it looks like after a year of growth. It's still quite small, and it definitely has a way to go before its blooming size. Now, taking one step up, this is considered a seedling from a local nursery, and I would venture to say that this is probably a 3-year-old seedling, if not older. There is about 5 canes on this plant, and there is 1 new growth. As you can see, they're still quite small, so I think that it will still be a while before this plant is large enough to bloom. The Cattleya Seedlings is considered one of the smaller, more compact plants. I think the largest that this plant can get is about 6 inches in height, so it's not going to get too much bigger, but it definitely is a lot bigger than this current seedling. For a larger comparison, I have the Cattleya Moriba Tiger, which is a cross between the Cattleya Leopoldii and the Cattleya Seedlings. This plant is also considered seedling size. I would venture to say that when I got it, it was about 5 years old from Flask, and I grew it last year, so it put out a new growth, but it hasn't bloomed. I'm hoping that this year or next year, the plant will be large enough to start creating a flower spike. So that will be from deflasking to blooming size. It'll take about 7 to 8 years. Now, not all Cattleyas are like this. Some hybrids tend to grow a little faster, and the smaller, more compact ones also tend to grow a little bit faster as well. If you're looking for more standard size Cattleyas, then that will take a little bit more time. So for example, I have the Lelia Zip. I got this last year as a seedling. This is considered a near blooming size seedling, so it hasn't bloomed before. And last year it looked like it was trying to bloom from its latest pseudobulb, but it didn't actually bloom. And this year it has 2 growths that are maturing, and it looks like there is 1 sheath in the newest cane. So hopefully this year it will actually bloom. So that means that this plant is about 6 or 7 years old before it finally blooms. And even though this larger plant is about the same size as the Cattleya Moriba Tiger, you can tell that there's a difference in the size aspect of the plant. So if all goes well, we should see blooms this summer, and if they're all empty sheaths, then I'll have to wait 1 more year. So growing Cattleyas from Flask is a longer waiting game than it is for a Phalaenopsis. So that's kind of the basic overview of maturity of plants and what is considered seedling. I think that term tends to be very vague in general, and it can refer to the plant at any stage, from being completely deflasked all the way up to right before it blooms. Those are still considered seedling size. That's why it's a challenge when a nursery says this is seedling size, because most of the time I think it refers to a plant being 2 to 3 years from blooming. But depending on which nursery and the photos and all of that, it can definitely take a little bit longer. So to take care of these seedlings requires a little bit more observation and maintenance than you would a normal blooming size plant. The mature blooming size plant can handle a little bit more abuse and have a little bit more leeway in terms of the environment and the conditions that it likes. If you stray from it, it will still be okay and it will still survive. When it comes to seedlings, it can cause setback, or it could just be more detrimental to the plants because they're a little bit more vulnerable. So when it comes to the term seedling size from a nursery, I think of them more as these kind of larger seedlings. So for these larger seedlings, whatever the conditions are for the plant, you want to keep them within those parameters. For example, for the Cattleya, I would give a little less light than what I would usually give to a blooming size Cattleya. I would give them slightly more water as well, and I would try to keep the temperature range that's not too extreme. Unfortunately, I don't have a temperature controlled environment, so my Cattleyas have to be able to handle the environment outside. Whatever the environment is, they just have to adapt. If I know these plants need a little bit more protection, then I'm gonna move them from my exposed patio to my side yard that gets a little bit more shade. For younger plants, I give them a little bit more shade, a little bit more water, a little less light and heat, so that it will have a better chance to grow. I want to keep it in a more protected environment so that it doesn't have pest problems. Hopefully it doesn't have any disease issues as well. As for Phalaenopsis, I try to keep all of them indoors, and growing under lights has definitely been the easiest way for me to take care of these seedlings. I have to keep them watered more, so they're potted up in sphagnum moss, and I just keep better track of these plants so that I know that they will do well. Overall, that's just kind of a way to monitor these plants better so that we don't have issues. So moving away from these larger size seedlings to these recently deflasked seedlings, those require the most patience and the most observation and care. So usually when they come deflasked, you want to maintain a humid environment for them as they're adjusting from life in a closed bottle to life in the ambient environment. Depending on the kind of plant you have, some can tolerate the ambient temperature immediately, like the Lalias and Cattleyas. They're fine. Same with the Phalaenopsis. I don't have to have a humidity dome over them initially. I can just put them straight out into my environment and they're fine. I just have to keep them well watered and they seem to do well. I've been handling seedlings for about 2 years now, and I'm going into my 3rd year growing them. So I'm getting a little bit better at understanding what to look for and how to take care of these plants. The primary problems I have with seedlings is having a disease problem or having a pest issue. So when it comes to pests, I've seen spider mites, I've seen aphids and thrips on these small plants. And when you see that, you have to treat it right away. So for me, I usually have to just dump all the media, put all the seedlings in a small bucket with a little bit of Phizan or a little bit of hydrogen peroxide or whatever it is that I need to treat the plant with to clean up all the pests. And then I just repot it again. They're small enough so that the repotting of these plants is not going to take a whole lot of time, and it doesn't require too much additional media. When it comes to disease issues, I think that mostly happens in the wintertime with me, and that's primarily because I want them to stay moist, but if they stay wet for too long, then they can get rot issues. Sometimes they also can get mold because of the cold and wet conditions. So in that case, I've been using a heat mat during the wintertime for these plants, and that seems to help them from getting rot. If I know that these plants are going to stay cold and wet for a while and I won't have time to maintain them and watch them super carefully, then I just spray all these plants with a little bit of a dilute Phizan solution just to make sure that there's no bacteria or fungus that's harboring inside the media. That really seems to help out from preventing the roots from dying off or preventing fungus or mold from taking over the pot. I think the winter season is always rough on the seedlings, especially the ones that like warmer weather. So that's why I think the heat mat is a huge boon. So that is kind of my regimen when dealing with seedlings. Also, I have a whole playlist about how I've been taking care of my seedlings. So you can refer to that if you're interested in learning more and more in depth about all the seedlings that I have. So the general environment of most of my seedlings is under lights, indoors, and it just has whatever ambient temperature that I have in my home. So basically that is a temperature range between 55 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit with a humidity between 40 and 60%. And I water all my plants with tap water, and I don't really fertilize my seedlings until they get to a stage that are like 2 or 3 years old. Then I would start introducing some fertilizer at that point, but for now it seems to be fine as is. I could probably push these plants to grow faster with more fertilizer, but I'm still trying to learn the ropes of dealing with deflasked plants. So for now, I'm just trying to improve my culture before adding fertilizer. Most of my seedlings are in sphagnum moss. A few of them are in seedling bark and perlite. And I noticed that I would probably repot the ones in bark like every year or so, versus the ones in moss. I tend to repot them every 6 months because the media ends up either covered in algae or it just starts to degrade or smell or something because of all the moisture that it holds. So I just like to do a nice refresh of those in moss every 6 months. My best advice when it comes to growing seedlings is definitely to have patience. It may be hard and it may be challenging, but it's definitely worth it when you finally see that seedling that you had grown finally come to bloom. If you would like to grow seedlings from flask, I would venture to say that Sarcochilus, Phalaenopsis, and Tolumnias tend to be the ones that grow the fastest and bloom the fastest from flask. And that may take anywhere from 2 to 3 years to get it to blooming size. If you're in it for the long haul, then almost any other genus will take at least 5 years or more before it becomes blooming size. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to grow a plant from flask. Otherwise, getting a seedling from a nursery will also take a couple of years for you to figure out how to grow them and be able to bloom them. If you're lucky, it can bloom within 1 year, and in some cases it can take up to 3 or 5 years, depending on the size that you get. And sometimes seedlings are really attractive because they're a lot more affordable than blooming size plants. But I think it's worth paying a little more to get a blooming size plant, especially if you're a newbie and if you really like to see flowers, then that's something to look for. Otherwise, I would suggest getting a blooming size plant if possible, so you can see your successes more immediately. And then if you do make mistakes, those plants are a little bit more forgiving. I've definitely lost my fair share of seedlings, and that's just part of the process. I already knew going into this that I would lose a lot of plants because I'm just trying to figure out how to grow things better. But I learn a lot from each mistake and each failure, and I think I'm definitely getting better at growing seedlings. So now it's not as intimidating or as challenging as I thought. The only thing now is finding enough space to house these plants as they get bigger. So that is just the general care of how I take care of my seedlings. If you grow them and you have tips on how I can improve, please let me know in the comments. And if you like this video and you want to see more, please hit the like button and follow the playlist. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!